And so at this point, I like to think a little visually. So you talked about how copywriters feel that they're involved at the end, and maybe they're involved at the end in a way where it doesn't feel like there's a lot of stability. For some reason, I'm thinking of, I don't know, someone barely hanging on to like a speedboat. That's the sort of vision in my head, right? And so if we just pause and just try to define the problem slightly differently. We started with copywriters feeling marginalized, and part of it's about being involved at the end. So what's the opposite of that? Trying to get involved early. So then the question would be for copywriters, how do you get involved early?
Welcome to The Fix. Sit down with copywriting experts Nick O'Connor and Glenn Fisher as they review, discuss, and improve real-world copy sent in by you. This is The Fix. Hello and welcome to this episode of The Fix. I'm not joined by my good buddy Nick O'Connor, but I'm joined by a very special guest, a man called Mark Pollard. Now, some of you will have heard of Mark. I certainly hope you have. If you haven't, then you're in for a treat. I've been secretly following Mark for, it must be nearly a decade, I reckon, but certainly a long time, from the days when Mark was a young man with a white shirt open, which I've noticed you've still got your website the same as that. But yeah, I've been following Mark's work for a long time. He's a very smart man, and he's very he's just one of those people where I'd describe it as he just gets it. And I've read a lot of his stuff, and I find it always very thoughtful. The different thing is, Mark's got a lot of things around words and copywriting and what have you. But for those who don't know Mark yet, he's essentially a strategist. I'm putting words in his mouth, and I'm going to give him the chance to define his own place in the world shortly. But Mark's kind of bag, if you like, is strategy and how that fits in the advertising world. Now, I'm interested I'm going to use this time we've got Mark for to explore just what strategy is, and kind of take it as I'll play the kind of fool and ask questions or what have you. I think there's a space in the world for copywriters to understand more about how strategic thinking can help them, not just in how to actually write copy. I'm leaving that for the side for now. I'm more thinking about all the questions we get asked about how do you get more jobs, how do you pitch people, how do you do that stuff. I always see some great stuff from Mark on this, so I want to use that as the platform for this. So enough of me rambling. Mark, maybe if you could give us a little introduction about yourself and tell me, what are you?
Thank you for the introduction, and awesome to be here. Happy to be speaking with you. Have listened to the pod. What am I? I mean, when I'm talking about strategy, I'm largely talking about account planning or strategy in the context of advertising agencies. So that's really what I'm talking about. These days, I do that kind of work, but I mostly train people and do talks around the world. So we'll have taught to thousands of people by the end of this year. And also just from the point of view of words, I mean, my favorite stuff to study at school was English. I was decent at it. I've always written. I published the first underground full-color hip-hop magazine in the Southern Hemisphere. I published a book, raised about 37 grand on Kickstarter for that 5 years ago. So words are integral to me. You know, if I'm walking down the street, an art director might be looking at symbols and signs and things like that, which I do as well, but my brain's literally just bouncing, looking at all the words and seeing what's interesting or funny about them all. So that's me.
That's you. And the book, by the way, Strategy is Your Words, which you self-put. That is an amazing, because it's a brilliant, beautiful looking book. It's well designed, done all that stuff. But you kind of self-published that, and then you've done it is it in Spanish, I'm thinking, as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, I avoid the word self-publish because, I have a company, so I published the book. I just find that there are certain words that I try to avoid because they sort of put you in this category where, I don't know, people can misunderstand you or understand you in a small way to make themselves feel okay, which is obviously not what you were trying to do. Even the word freelance, when I've worked with companies, I would avoid that because they would treat me as someone in their 40s. Back in the day when I was doing a lot more consulting or working with companies, they would try to treat me as like a 25-year-old freelancer. I was like, I'm not a freelancer. So yeah, it's 80,000 words. I tried to write the crap out of it. I think some of it's okay. It's beautifully designed. I had friends who helped me with my magazine back in the day design it, and I wanted it to be something of an art object. So it's a book about business, but it's weird, it's absurdist. It goes into the minds of the people who do this work to the point where my favorite piece of feedback is it's the first time I've seen myself in a book. I love that because people who do this kind of work, I'm sure copywriters would identify with this, but a lot of strategists are quite isolated in their work, and they can be quite isolated in life as well. I find not all of them, but a lot of them, they're in their heads a lot. And so, and they're constantly studying other people. And to do that, often you take a position of being an outsider. And then you can often feel that people don't really understand you that well. Your brain's really active all the time. And so, yeah, it was really meaningful to get that book out. And the second book that I'm threatening to write will be called Write Yourself into Public, which is taking a lot of the conversations that I have with people when I travel who want to be more active online and giving them a little framework and different ways of thinking about how to put themselves out there. When a lot of people, one of their main reasons for not doing that is they just find it really cringy. Like, oh, I don't want to be that person. But I think you can treat it as a writing practice, and that's probably the way through. It's the way through for me.
Yeah, there's ways to do that. I'm going to pause briefly before I ask you about strategy, just because on that book thing, when I say self-publish, I know what you mean when you say it kind of it minimizes it slightly, but that I thought that was the very clever thing about your publishing of that book. That looks like it's a professional. It is a great book. It looks more, but then it's interesting because words and how you define yourself. I think there's like a big problem in the copywriting industry. I was just talking the other day at a social event we did here in Sheffield, actually, with a copywriter who was calling themselves a content writer. And then if you're just providing content, then people just go, oh, I just need some words for that thing, rather than seeing you as someone who might bring some strategic thinking to your business, might get you new customers, might do all these things. And it's this minimizing in exactly the same way as freelancer, self-published, all of these words, the kind of double-edged swords, in the sense that yes, they represent in one like camp a good thing, but then in another it's actually kind of defining it for the audience. They're going to look at you in a different way when those words are used.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I was looking at research last week, which is what I do. And, copywriting, this copywriting's under pressure. I mean, artificial intelligence is probably going to affect copywriting and then art direction pretty quickly. I know a lot of strategists are nervous about this being, fearing being marginalized. And so it is important to define yourself, I think, in a specific way, but also in a broad way that communicates additional value. Because if you're just words, which is really, really important, but if you're quote unquote just words, then for a lot of people, that is going to seem cheap and replaceable increasingly in the next few years.
Yeah, exactly. So coming back to strategy then, when you go into, you mentioned you do a lot of teaching about it, you go into a lot of agencies and you're looking, what are you, for an absolute beginner, what are you looking for? What, if I say, right, Mark, I've got this business, I need you to come in, look at me, talk to me about strategy. How can you help? What are you looking to do?
Yeah, so the guts of strategy in the context of advertising, and I can define any jargon that I use, I'll try to define it. But what I'm looking for is I want to understand the business problems, what's going on in the business, what's changed recently, what's working, what's not working. So it starts there. You want to know a little bit about the competition. What are they doing well? What are they not doing well? Are there gaps? What are the gaps? You want to understand what's happening with people as well. So the audience or the customers, the users, whatever you want to call them, what's motivating them in life, what's in their way when it comes to buying something from the company. And so I guess, to be simplistic, they're the three things that I would largely focus a short conversation on.
And you was just saying there about, I'm just wrote down the word research, because you said research a couple of times, that you're looking at people, you're looking at where the business are, you're looking at competition, and it's just reminding me of how much we would encourage copywriters to, before they even write a single word, to start researching.
Yeah.
And it does rely on that, and it's in those same areas. What are the competition doing? What is your prospect doing? What's the market at large doing? Do you find that that is where your majority of time is researching the world, the customer, what's going on around?
Yeah. So if I was to actually consult with a company, not just train them, then usually what I'd be doing is I'd try to do, maybe 15 to 30 interviews. Most companies that I work with these days, they don't lack data, or data, however you want to say it, but they don't lack numbers, they don't lack information. What they do lack is signal, and they lack creativity and a clear, provocative, interesting way forward. And so I would usually take the information that's on hand and I speak to people, and I do it increasingly journalistically. I used to write for a lot of magazines and do radio, so I've sort of settled there as my style of interview, but generally looking into attitudes and usage of a product or a category, trying to understand the customer journey, again, the barriers, the obstacles that are in people's way when it comes to buying something from a company, their pain points, their needs, their motivations, how they understand the category, how they understand the competition, what's going on in their lives, essentially. And the way that I work, and this is all in the book, half the book is built around this framework that I use called the 4 points. There's another very well-known framework called the 4 C's, where you're looking at the consumer truth, the category or competitive truth, the cultural truth, and the company truth. And through those 4 things, which end up being 4 boxes on a slide or 4 boxes on a page, you're trying to find some tension or opportunity to then work out what the brand could do and or say that could help them stand out and hopefully improve in the future. But for me, I use the 4 points. I look at the problem, insight, advantage, and strategy, and it's just like a simple way to try to generate signal from a lot of noise, a lot of information.
It's interesting. Nick, who the co-founder of thefix, often says it, and I think it's an insightful thing. But in the advertising world, it is just a lot of noise, and we are trying to create the signal that stands out in it. So it's interesting that you echo that. In that respect, when you're looking at the advertising industry now and you're seeing all of this noise, I'm interested where your take on advertising generally is at the moment. What are the I say mistakes because it's kind of leading question, but what are the challenges and mistakes that you're seeing advertisers and advertising agencies make to get themselves lost in that noise at the moment?
There's a few things that I come across, not to flex, but when I'm answering a question like this, my mind goes through all the people I've spoken to this year. I've been in, I don't know, maybe 10 countries and talked to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. I think the first one is a lack of ambition. I think that's really in the way of the industry at large doing better work. So that's one. 2, the business model of what we all do when it comes to anything that's strategic or creative, that's a service. I think the business models that a lot of people have inherited, especially selling time, just doesn't make sense. Because this, you might get briefed on a Friday, you're going to be thinking about that brief probably all weekend or a lot of it. And you might be taking the dog for a walk or nursing a baby and something comes to mind. You're like, oh, but you can't charge time for that. I think the third thing that I see a lot of is with these kinds of roles, being in more companies than ever, while also being under more pressure than ever, they're often reporting into people and organizations that are not strategically or conceptually trained, but for some reason they have power over people who are those things. And that can lead to these weird cultures. So if I'm going into a large non-agency, so a large company where they might have an in-house team, they might have a marketing team, copywriters, art directors, maybe some strategists, maybe there's like performance marketing, all these things. They end up trying to work out how to create processes to solve for big cultural issues. which is that maybe the wrong people have too much say over all the work that we all do without an adequate ambition either. And so it just leads to a lot of mediocrity. And I don't want to be, as I get older, I want to be the old guy complaining about that. But I think when you look at a lot of the work out there, it's just not that good. So they're sort of four of the dynamics that I see a lot of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to. There's no answer to this, Mark, and you'd certainly get. I'd have to. You'd have to invoice me for a lot of money to get the thing. But how do you fix that? Like, how if we take the like just one thing, because I agree with you across the board. Then I think it's a really good way of like isolating those different problems. But with that ambition, I guess if we go there, because I think I look at a lot of copy in the world, and I agree that the ambition and a lot of copywriters themselves, I'll take it the hit, I think are quite not lazy, but they're not incentivized to go outside the box to think as creatively as they can and to do the work. And that comes back to the time billing, and it comes back to the way it's set up for the management to kind of assess them. How would you go about changing that, or beginning to kind of explore that from all the kind of talking that you've been doing?
Yeah, for me, it's kind of high-ish level. I'd love to see a world in which creativity in business is just more applauded. I think it's great that we have all these MBAs running all these companies, but it would help if they understood creativity a little bit, if they understood the psychology of people who do that work, because without them being interested in it and empathetic towards the people who do it, they're going to keep repeating the same patterns that we're seeing right now. I think the second thing is education around marketing effectiveness, which the UK is really, really good at, I imagine, especially in London. And I know I always find it funny with people in England where they talk about London, if they're outside of London, like it's miles and miles and miles away. It's a really small country if you look at a map, people. But I know that there is a bit of an echo chamber in London, and a lot more discussion around marketing effectiveness through organizations like Walk, probably IPA, etc. So they're the two things. But so the marketing effectiveness can get some of the business people across the line, or the research around the marketing sciences can get some of the senior people across the line. But I just yearn for a world in which creativity and people who do creative work for a living are, I don't know, a little more famous, a little more looked up to, because that's just decreased over the past few decades, I feel.
Who do you look up to in the kind of history? Who is for you like creative people that that inspire you?
Well, there are definitely people, if I think especially about who's in my book, because I think that's probably a useful place to start. I mean, Edward de Bono. So he's written tens and tens of books about creativity. He promoted lateral thinking, and his book, The Uses of Lateral Thinking, that was published around 1967. I use a lot of his tools, and his tools sort of put creativity and ideas in my hands in a really useful, practical way. So there. I spend a lot of time watching stand-up comedy. I watch a lot of Netflix. But again, people like Alan Watts just have this incredible way with words. An English comparative theologian who brought Zen Buddhism to the US. He had TV shows. He was a bit of a star. But the way he talks, and I know often he's sort of paraphrasing things that he's read, but he was just an amazing speaker. And to me, very creative in that sense. He could come up with really interesting metaphors that get in your head, and so that's a form of creativity. Grew up around rap and graffiti, so there's a certain element of that culture, of hip-hop culture, that's in me a little bit. Sometimes people say my writing that they can hear a certain cadence, especially if they've heard me talk. That's sort of they're the main worlds that I pillage. And also YouTube, watch a lot of travel YouTube, and think quite a lot about how to bring some of the elements that I see people using successfully on YouTube into like the live events that I do. So it's one of those questions that it's just so big, it's hard to answer, but they're the things and the people that come to mind.
They will come back. You've just been, I guess this kind of links to that as far as like inspiration goes, because I follow you on Instagram and stuff, and I see you all about. You've been on an absolute journey recently. Or you was in, I think, Lima or Peru or something. Last time I saw you, like having some tacos or something somewhere. What have you been doing? I feel like you've been on a kind of mission or almost kind of thing. What's that been about?
Well, now the world's opened up, since 2020, it's been good to get on the road again. So it's mainly talks and training. I've done it in this year, Mexico City, Sofia in Bulgaria, Lima in Peru. A few days later, I was in Iceland, a bunch around the States as well, San Francisco, Texas, all over. Ecuador, Georgia is amazing. Please, everybody, go to Georgia, which is northeast of Turkey. Whenever you say Georgia, most people are like, where? So northeast of Turkey. I was in Turkey. Yeah, I've had an amazing year. Been really fortunate. Usually doing events for, I don't know, 100 to 200 people if it's just me doing a masterclass. Georgia was a conference. Brazil, Hacktown, awesome conference. It's largely in Portuguese, but awesome conference about 2 hours north of Sao Paulo. And yeah, just my whole journey, and this is what the book was about. The book was me trying to work out how to share all the things that I taught, all the things that I believed in a way where if I died after publishing it, I'd be like, at least I got that out. At least I got that out. A lot of the events that I do, a lot of the travel I do is this ongoing journey of just trying to become more of who I want to be.
Sure.
Having felt a little bit repressed and having dealt with melancholy and depression over the years, and having tried to do the corporate life, having kids relatively young, and I needed to express, and advertising wasn't a big enough way, like it wasn't a big enough vessel for me to do it in. And so now I put a lot of stuff online and publish because I need to, but I also need that social interaction. And it's been really funny because I was more in the hip hop scene in my 20s while working in agencies, largely doing like user experience and information architecture. And at Leo Burnett, when I was 28, I moved into the account planning department and did 50% of my work focused on digital projects and 50% focused on advertising and brand. But I never really identified as being in advertising. It made me cringe a little bit. And then since I've been on this journey over the past 7 or 8 years doing my own thing out of New York, I just realized that the people that I meet and the people I get to talk to, I don't have the same kinds of conversations with other people. And often I'm just not interested in a lot of conversations. Like, I'm relatively talkative. I listen a lot. I interview a lot, but I just can't deal with the dryness and the corporateness of
you
the
mean
world.
in regards to the well, let's talk about advertising now. It's that element, and that's just like, that's kind of not that's not where the interesting stuff is. The interesting stuff is, oh well, actually, have you seen, this is what's happening in this world kind of thing, and then that actually feeds back into the advertising stuff.
No, actually, I don't mind talking about advertising. I love business. So wherever I go, I'll be talking to someone about their agency or their freelance life, and are they earning enough money? What could you do? Like, I'm kind of addicted to that kind of conversation. So I enjoy that. But also, with writers, but also especially with strategists, they're researchers, they're students, they're constantly coming across things, and you can bounce between lots of different topics. You can have really open, sometimes raw and vulnerable conversations. You could talk about depression, you could talk about bipolar, you could talk about all these kinds of things in a way where in a lot of the rest of our lives we just can't. And so the travel, the trips is me trying to animate myself, me trying to be alive. And it's been beautiful.
Yeah, I'm sure. As what I mean, without making it facile and like reductive, but what's like forefront of your mind? What's like been the biggest kind of takeaways, or the biggest moments of experience where it's like, wow, that was something.
Yeah, so this year I'd say the 3 places that are most on my mind are Georgia. So I was at a conference called Ad Black Sea that ran a strategy session on stage in front of about 1,000 people. I do talks, but usually I'll use that kind of time to try to do something, either with someone or various people on stage or with the audience. And so I had a guy, Lado Malazzoni, who has been working at JWT as a strategist and also as a creative director. He came up on stage, and I ran him through this session to make a point about how our most important clients are ourselves. And so I applied the strategy framework that I used, the 4 points, to him and his life. He ended up quitting on stage in front of 1,000 people because his main problem, which is where I start, is like he said, I don't think I want to work in this industry anymore. His wife was in the audience too. So that was one of those beautiful moments where when it happened, I was like, hang on, was this staged? And then I had to realize that I was on the stage and I hadn't staged it. Therefore, had he staged it without my knowledge, but then how could have that happened? How could that have happened? So that was really, really beautiful. I'd love to spend some time in Georgia. Turkey blew me away. I'd never been to Istanbul before, and I went there to get a couple of operations done, and it's on my mind. I was watching videos about it all the time. I could live there. If I did, I would go to Georgia, but then the other place I'd love to spend more time in is Brazil.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
Istanbul is, I feel like obliged to say it because it's one of the best places I've ever been. It was just, it absolutely, something about it took me out. I was obsessed with it, reading a novelist called Orhan Pamuk, who'd written a load of books set in Istanbul. And I went there like a kind of literary geek, like finding my heroes kind of thing. But the place is something magical about the place.
It is. It's spectacular. I mean, the architecture is incredible. The history, to think about how many millions of people would have gone through that area, the Ottoman Empire. It's really quite modern. There's a lot of poverty there and a lot of issues. You know, I think especially in the eastern parts with the Kurds, that population struggles, generally speaking, but it definitely struggles in Turkey. But near the water on the coast, I mean, it's really modern. It's so affordable. Like I live in New York and it's so stressful. Like my break even here is so expensive and it's so stressful. Whereas in Turkey, it's beautiful. It's relatively peaceful if you want it to be. And you can get beautiful food for like $5. And, you know, the people in Georgia, Turkey, they're so hospitable. I'm going to put those together because they're relatively close and they're on my mind all the time. It's just so hospitable. Amazing. But yeah.
Nice place. Anyway, I'll bring it back slightly from our holiday recommendations. But so we're back in the kind of world of strategy, and we've already like talked about the kind of bigger picture stuff of where there's challenges and what have you. But as I said at the beginning, I'm interested in for copywriters. I get a lot of questions from people who kind of still trying to find their place in the advertising world, and they've been kind of slightly I'll say sidelined in when it comes to marketing, when it comes to advertising, as a concept in itself. Like copywriting is can be often seen as such a small part of that. And I wondered, from your experience in speaking to agencies and speaking to, I know you speak to so many people in the industry across the board, what's your experience of how copywriting fits into that mix when you're doing strategic kind of deep dives and trying to figure stuff out? Where do you see copy fitting into the mix?
Well, I guess when I'm doing strategy, copywriting doesn't really fit in much at all, except when I'm looking at the work that the brand's done and the work that the competitors have done. It doesn't really fit in. And even if you look at the advertising process, let's say that there are sort of three large-ish moments. One is, we'll just call it strategy. Two is idea or campaign concept, and then three is the actual writing. I think a lot of copywriters, they're just doing the writing, you know, and I think one thing that gets in the way of a lot of copywriters, I've worked with a lot, but there's a sense of ego, narcissism, identity, where someone's like, I'm a copywriter, but not all copywriters are conceptually trained. Not all copywriters are conceptual at all. So that's one place to start. But I think for a copywriter who just wants to make more of a difference on any project from now on, the two places that are useful are trying to define the problem, the business problem, and then spending a little bit of time trying to work out the the obstacles that are in front of people that are preventing them from buying the thing. You know, they're the two easiest places to start that most clients would be happy to have a conversation about, unless they really just want you to do the words.
Yeah, well, that's it. Well, it's funny. I always think these things, when you're put into a position of teaching and training, and I'd be interested to know your take on this more philosophically, but I in my experience, I've found that all of the advice is quite mundane. It's quite straightforward, and it becomes quite repetitive, in the sense that we're constantly saying, ironically, that you need to get out of just the writing, you need to be in the ideas situation, you need to be in the early stage strategy, you need to be thinking what a person's problem is, a business's problem, rather than just going, can I write some copy for you? It's like, well, no, I'm really fucking busy. I need to get I've got a real problem over here. That problem, the solution to that problem might be better words and better copy. But if you go in saying, can I write copy for you? And they don't know that that's the problem, then you're just another problem to them. You're another bother, you're another thing in the inbox. And you've just said the same thing from your side of things. It's get kind of back upstream towards where the early decisions are made, where the ideas are formed, where the problems and the strategies are worked out. I'm saying that, and I'm interested, as someone who you teach a lot, Mark, and go around the world teaching, and how do you reconcile the fact that, or actually, I'm leading you first, I should ask you, do you find that it's often very simple approaches that people need to take, and it's actually the discipline of taking them that is the challenge? If that is the case, what do you like? What's your take on that? If I don't want to lead you down a path, but
yeah, well, it will appear at some point to be simple, but you know, this writing looks simple. It's not until you've written a lot, and you know, you need a way with words, and there are certain. It's worth, again, for the copywriters to look in some of the research around words. There's a really interesting piece of research about monogamous words, and how monogamous words, which are words that don't cheat, words that don't have a lot of synonyms. For example, the word pineapple. I say the word pineapple, we're mostly thinking of the fruit. It's a monogamous word, but monogamous words are memorable, and the whole point of advertising is to create things that are memorable, to get into the memory, so that if someone has a purchase need or whatever it is, the brand might have a toe in the memory, and that's it. But yeah, it'll appear simple, but the more you do this, the more experience you have, the more research you might have read, the more results you've seen, good and bad, the more conversations you've had. And so I could sometimes sit down with people for 30 minutes and help them solve pretty chunky problems, and then the challenge is, well, how much is that 30 minutes worth? Yeah, but at some point it'll appear simple, and it needs to be and appear simple at some point. Otherwise, no one's going to implement it. There'll be no action taken.
Sure. No, it's funny about the I'll ask you, and don't feel obliged to answer, but like, when you talk about that that timing and charging situation, where do you go? What's the, because it is such a, I try and offer advice to copywriters when it comes to kind of, people often feel, oh, well, I'm only writing this page. It's like, yeah, but that page might go on and solve that business's problem for the rest of time. If we want to get silly about it, they're going to constantly get returns on that, and you're just going to charge for 2 hours that you wrote that kind of thing. It doesn't make sense. Where are the clues that we can kind of go down avenues there? Have you figured anything out?
It's so hard. I mean, you know, when I'm doing more of the consulting work, and really I've been building a training business, and I've had people working for me, and you know, like last year we paid out about 50 people. This year I've had about 8 to 10 people working with me for most of it. So that's really where I spend a lot of my time. But I do sort of train, and then also at the same time work with companies through the training to devise creative briefs and coach them through the advertising process as well. It's really hard. I mean, when I'm working, I will think about what an hourly rate could be and how many hours I would expect to work on it, just so I've got a number in the back of my mind. But I don't charge hours. So, you know, the other models are, for example, value-based, which is, maybe you develop packages, but again, that can make you easier to buy, but at some point you might feel like you're losing value. And then the third way to do it is as you know, trying to get some kind of performance-based incentive, but they're super hard to make happen. And one of the main challenges around all of this is not only all the people who do this kind of work, whether it's writing or strategy, feeling marginalized, but they're often selling into people in agencies that are being marginalized, or into marketing teams that are being marginalized as well. There's this big trend over the past decade where marketers don't seem to have a lot of status, power in their own companies. So it's just this chain of marginalization that's going on, and it's tough. But I wouldn't mind just kicking around a problem for you, just for people who haven't done this kind of work before. It'll be very, very simple. But why don't we play with the problem of copywriters feeling marginalized? And I just want to dig into it a few times, right? So
Yeah.
I'll ask you questions. You just give me a sentence answer, and we'll see if it gets to somewhere slightly interesting. But I just want to show how practical and relatively easy these techniques can be, and how somebody could listen to this episode and in their very next meeting potentially change the dynamic with their client. So if we start with the issue that copywriters feel marginalized, I'm just going to ask why. So just give me a sentence. Why do they feel marginalized?
Why do copywriters feel marginalized? Because they are often involved at the end. It feels like everything's been done before they're involved.
Okay. Why are they involved at the end?
Because they feel like that's what the system dictates, in the sense that you come to the project afterwards.
Okay. Why do they believe that?
Because they've seen other people do it.
Okay. And why are
other people doing it?
Yeah.
Because of structures that have been put in place, whereby that's how you would pitch your work to people, based on what the existing model is.
Okay. So that's like just asking why a few times. But at this point, what I would then do is go, well, what problems is this causing? This structure, what problems is this causing? And essentially in my head, there'll be a little mind map. So maybe give me 3 symptoms of the problem that this is causing.
Yeah. So we'll start with money. Cheap hit, ironic, but like, it means that I can't charge much for my services because the terms are already fixed. It means my output is limited by the scope of the briefs that I'm not necessarily involved with, and it means that I'm not as creatively fulfilled. So I will then have a personal anxiety, in the sense that, well, I feel marginalized because of myself, because I've not done the best I can do.
Yeah. And so at this point, I like to think a little visually. So you talked about how copywriters feel that they're involved at the end, and maybe they're involved at the end in a way where it doesn't feel like there's a lot of stability. For some reason, I'm thinking of, I don't know, someone barely hanging on to like a speedboat. That's the sort of vision in my head, right? And so if we just pause and just try to define the problem slightly differently. We started with copywriters feeling marginalized, and part of it's about being involved at the end. So what's the opposite of that? Trying to get involved early. So then the question would be for copywriters, how do you get involved early? And I know we're not saying anything that you wouldn't have spoken about and thought about a lot, but I just wanted to show a few questions, some reframing. Involved at the end, how do you get involved early? And that, for the copywriter or for the copywriter's business, is where the strategy would start. That's, you need to think through that in a kind of creative way.
Yeah, well, I think it just evidences that. I mean, I'm familiar with it through kind of mental health stuff, through teaching copywriter stuff, and having the luxury of being able to be the one who can ask the questions. It's about being honest about the problems as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key thing, because, and also when you do those exercises, which I would recommend people do, because it will always be slightly different for your own situation. I'm trying to generalize where a copywriter might be, and it's going to be different if you're in-house or whether you're freelance or whatever. But when you do that, and if you answer it, I often found, I've found him personally across numerous things in business and in personal life, is that probably by the second or third kind of why, or the second kind of, well, why is that? You'll start to go, hang on a minute, I know what the problem is here. Is I need to do this. I need to get ahead of that. But at that point, it's not to go, all right, okay, I've buggered up. I should have done that. I know that. It's like, all right, that's I need to do that. What's stopping me from doing that? The answer is ultimately going to come back to you yourself. Don't get me wrong, the incredible cynic in me is like, yeah, but that business is thingy. But then actually, and Nick talks about this a lot, and me and Nick are both like run businesses. I don't think there's any business like manager who, if someone came to you and goes, I'd like to figure a problem out for you, and I've figured this kind of thing out, who was not going to go, all right, okay, nice one, like that's interesting, or at least be a lot further down into the meeting than, hi, can I do this thing for you that you've already got people doing for you, kind of thing.
Well, there's research that suggests that the top salespeople sell problems. You know, they might respond to a pitch request like other companies, but they're generally trying to define the problem in an interesting way. And that's salespeople who are not in our industry. They could be selling airplanes or factories, but you tend to do better and have a better, longer relationship with companies or with people if you can say, yeah, we can respond to that brief, but also we've done our own research and this is the problem that we think you need to solve, or that we could help you solve, and here's how we would do it. But also, having said that, not all cultures, not all people like the word problem. You can appear to be a problem if you mention it. The way that I work, I like to have very provocative, loaded problems. And for some people, that can feel like criticism. It can feel like you're pointing out that they didn't do something correctly. So you've got to be a little gentle in some cultures with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, it's good advice. I was fearful that we've slightly brought it back there, Mike. I was fearful that we were getting into a slightly older man situation of shaking our fist at the industry, and I was good, but we brought it back. But I will still ask you to leave on a positive note. What are you most hopeful about at the moment? You've been around the world literally past few weeks. What's kind of inspired you most and got you most excited about being in the advertising space and finding that this is the world that we work in? What are you looking positively towards the future for?
I mean, creativity itself is optimistic, isn't it? It's looking at the mess that is happening, the mess that faces us in our day-to-day lives, but possibly even on a global scale, and trying to work out how to be useful with that mess, how to create things. And that to me is really, really optimistic. I met this really cool I think they're a collective in Georgia called Water Guns with a Z. They use creativity to drive social change in their own country. So they picked up an award at the festival that I was at for a campaign that got Tbilisi, which is the capital of Georgia, to add women's names to street signs, because apparently there were no women's names on any street signs. And I gave out the award in front of like 1,500 people. 10 to 15 of this collective came up on stage, and they were just so excited. And they've done a lot of other campaigns, and it's those kinds of faces that, I don't know, they bring me a lot of joy, because they're taking the skills that a lot of us have and they're trying to work out how to create positive change in the world. And they're not cynical. They're frustrated. A lot of the people that I've talked to this year, they're in countries literally where narcos and mafia are killing politicians, where within a few years, so for example, in Ecuador, since 2020 especially, that country is really struggling because all the Colombian drugs are coming through Ecuador now because they've got ports. Politicians are getting killed. A lot of the people that I know basically live in cages. It's really sort of sad to see. In Georgia, Russia's taken 2 bits of Georgia in the past 20 years. The kids are paranoid. They're not paranoid, but they're scared that Russia's going to keep going. And so I think the stresses that are out there, and yet the way that a lot of people who are creative are trying to use ideas to change the world, I think that's quite uplifting.
Good. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mark. It's fantastic talking to you. And for people who have enjoyed this, if you go to markpollard.com.
.net.
Oh,
.net. But
your emails.com. That's why I was...
No, it's markpollard.net has a bunch of essays, but I also publish on Instagram and LinkedIn at Mark Pollard. And if you go to the Instagram, I often release like free ebooks. There's one on insights. There's how to do strategy, simple ebooks. So if you go there, you should be able to find a post where you can DM me, and then one of my automations will annoyingly send you a link to something.
A robotic version of you is there and waiting to speak. Yes. But no, it's an absolute pleasure, and people certainly should check out your stuff because it's really good. And you've still, I mean, you're good. What printing are you on of the book now? It must be
done 3, and I put it up on Kindle with Spanish and Portuguese. So I think we've sold 7,500 copies. I was hoping to sell 5. Most books don't sell.
That's great.
On average, I think books sell a couple of hundreds. So to have sold that many, and that was basically back in 2020, the book and courses I built around the book were how I fed my family because everything got cancelled. So yeah, it's a special book to me, and some of it's okay.
Yeah, it's good. It's good stuff. Right. Thanks very much, Mark. I will, and thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll be back again looking at some more copy very soon. Speak then. If you enjoy The Fix and want to get access to even more good stuff, join the Fix Accelerator today. Get access to special masterclasses from Nick and me, watch expert interviews with industry legends, join live copy feedback sessions every week, and get connected to our very own private copy network. Visit thefixaccelerator.com for more information.